Hello, Neanderthal peers, and welcome to a quiet journey back to the Ice Age. There, in the icy valleys and damp, dark caves, a human species once existed, the Neanderthals. Let this story guide each breath, not to embellish legend, but to touch the surviving traces of science. The fragments of bone, the stone tools, the remnants of fire, all combine into a memory of a vanished species. If the value of this journey touches you, preserve it. Each story of Neanderthals is not only knowledge, but also a way for the imagination to see the old world, where humans did not stand alone at the top, but were intertwined within a chain of survival challenges. Imagine, as you listen, perhaps you lie in darkness, or walk among modern crowds, yet the memory of Neanderthals remains here. If the story lulls you to sleep, the markers of time will bring you back, for the entire journey from beginning to end is worth listening to. Tonight, we enter a haunting question. Were Neanderthals violent? And if so, where did this violence begin? If we see Neanderthals as purely predators, we forget the truth. Most of the time, they themselves were prey in a world full of dangerous beasts. Neanderthals appeared more than 400,000 years ago, in Europe and Western Asia, within vast grasslands and cold, dense forests. This human species lived under the shadow of cave lions, leopards, giant hyenas, and cave bears. Archaeological records show Neanderthal bones sometimes bear marks of predator bites, or wounds that healed after violent encounters. Survival in that world relied not only on strength. Neanderthals depended on group cohesion, on the skill of sharing fire, and on tools made from stone and bone. Without claws or speed, they relied on coordination and craft. What remains in caves? Sharp-edged stone tools, long bones split for marrow. Ashes of fires reflects a collective survival strategy. These traces remind us the default position of Neanderthals was not as rulers, but as fragile links. They remained vigilant at every moment, cooperating every day. A child's footprint alongside an adult's imprinted in frozen sediment shows the group moved together, protecting one another. Yet this fragility also gave rise to a form of violence. At first it was not directed at kin, but against predators. A log, a rock, a sharpened wooden spear, all arose from the need for defense. These crude weapons were not meant to kill swiftly, but to delay, buying enough time for the group to escape. Safety came from numbers. Collective shouts, synchronized movements, showers of thrown stones, all combined into an illusion of power. At the center of this was coordination. This was the seed of social cohesion that archaeology still sees in traces of mutual care. Bones healed after breaks. Lost teeth survived because the group supported the individual. Neanderthal weapons gradually became sharper. They made spear points affixed to wooden shafts, flint knives, and polished hand axes. These tools were not only for butchering prey, but also for deterrence and defense. In a world of massive beasts, even a small tool was a fragile shield against the dark. From here, the question becomes haunting when a spear can pierce an animal's hide. Was it ever used against other Neanderthal groups? When a rock can break bone, did it ever strike a fellow human? Archaeology leaves fragments of bone cracked for unknown reasons. Some Neanderthal skulls show breaks not caused by predators, but by impact with hard objects. This could be accidental, but it could also be evidence of clashes between groups in lands where resources were scarce. So where did Neanderthal violence begin? Perhaps from the fear of being preyed upon, from the need to threaten, to strike back. to act collectively in order not to vanish. From this foundation, violence may have turned inward, not only against predators, but against members of the same species. Bones, tools, and charred remains tell the same story. To be Neanderthal was first to be vigilant, cooperative, and capable of resistance. Aggression did not arise from conquest, but from refusal to remain prey. And from this refusal, Neanderthals created weapons, tools that sometimes saved lives, but could also deliver death. In a European cave, animal bones bearing precise cut marks still lie among ashes. Fine, straight incisions made by Mousterian blades show Neanderthals did not wait for predators to finish feeding. They could access prey early, claim portions, and through stone tools, shift the balance of power against other hunters. A sharpened flint fragment was a movable claw in the cold world. For Neanderthals, a Mousterian tool was not merely a shard. It was intentionally crafted with skill. Points, straight edges, scrapers, awls, all composed of versatile toolkit. Crafting required memory, teaching, and reflected a tradition spanning hundreds of thousands of years. These tools expanded survival capabilities, skinning, dissection, scraping flesh, separating tendons, breaking bones. The symmetry and precision in many artifacts suggest an underlying sense of aesthetics, though uncertain. What is clear is that Mousterian tools transformed Neanderthals into master hunters and scavengers in the Pleistocene. Environment: the remains of bison, horses, rhinoceroses, and mammoths at various sites bear characteristic cut marks. With tools in hand, Neanderthals could strip flesh quickly, even compete directly with cave lions and hyenas. But evidence also reveals another truth. Tools were not only for animals. Some Neanderthal skulls, from Atapuerca to Shenandoah, show fractures, depressions, and damage from strong blows. Many match the size of sticks or stones. Some injuries had healed, indicating survival after head trauma. Others are paramortem, occurring just before death. The question arises, were these wounds from predators or from fellow humans? Many cases cannot be explained by predation. Some skulls bear repeated, symmetrical injuries, patterns resembling human-to-human conflict. The presence of healed wounds shows violence did not always result in death, but it was ever present, intertwined with daily life. In Spain, Tecima de los Huesos, pit of bones, reveals a chilling story. Among at least 28 individuals, a famous skull, cranium 17, bears 2 deep cracks on the forehead near the eye socket. To blows, same location, same force, clearly indicate intentional action. This could be the oldest known homicide in Neanderthal lineage. These evidences show how fragile the line is between butchering prey and harming a fellow human. But the story is not only about violence. It is also about care and cooperation. At Shenandoah Cave in Iraq, a Neanderthal with a withered arm, deformed skull, and multiple severe injuries survived to adulthood. This could only occur if the community supported, shared food, and protected the weak. Within the same species, tools could injure, but also sustain disabled individuals. Hunting evidence also shows collective coordination. Wooden spears from Schegenin, Germany, about 300,000 years old, indicate Neanderthal predecessors ambushed wild horses. This strategy required cooperation, planning, and shared risk. Under social stress, such ambush skills could translate into ambushing rival groups. Violence and compassion, hunting and care coexisted. Stone tools have no intent, Meaning lies in how the community used them. A flint blade could break a mammoth bone, cut a deer tendon, or injure a Neanderthal skull. The Neanderthal world was not dominated by violence. Most cut marks on bones were for processing prey. But once tools existed, the door to intergroup conflict opened, and that door never fully closed. Neanderthals coordinated to bring down large animals like wild horses. Such cooperation was impressive, requiring planning, patience, and shared risk. But the coordination used in hunting could reflect into coordination in conflict. The ability to ambush a herd across the steppe could, under tension, become ambushing rivals against another group. Violence, therefore, was not an isolated invention, but an implicit consequence of skills honed for survival. Neanderthal bones and those of their ancestors reveal something subtler: healed injuries, evidence of long-term care. Some individuals broke limbs but lived long enough for the bones to mend. This implies the presence of other hands sustaining them, providing food, shielding them from predators. It reminds us that Neanderthals were capable not only of inflicting harm, but also of protecting and nurturing their kind. Violence and compassion coexisted, both arising from tools and social bonds. A stone knife could wound, but it could also cut tendons and flesh to feed the weak. The tool itself bore no intent. The community's choices assigned it meaning. Around the mid-Pleistocene, Neanderthal ancestors left a dual legacy, both hunter and hunted, capable of crafting tools to extend food supply, reshape landscapes, alter social dynamics, but also carrying the potential to spill blood within their own group. Fossil records do not depict a world flooded with constant violence, but a door left open. Once stone became both weapon and tool, that door never fully closed. Could this be the scene of the first homicide in Neanderthal lineage? The question arises from a discovery in northern Spain, Cima de los Huesos, the pit of bones containing remains of at least 28 Neanderthal ancestors. These individuals lived around 450,000 years ago, belonging to a precursor population of Neanderthals. Bones stacked in the darkness of Atapuerca offer a strange window into life and death during the Middle Pleistocene. Among them, a particular skull, cranium 17, became a focal point, possibly the earliest evidence of homicide. The skull is incomplete, but enough remains to reconstruct the forehead and face. Notably, there are 2 cracks above the left eye socket. Each is deep, oval, nearly identical in size. Forensic analysis indicates they resulted from blunt force, possibly a stone tool or club. The symmetry is too precise to be accidental. Both blows struck at the same angle and location, strong enough to fracture bone. More importantly, they do not resemble accidental injuries. A fall may break a bone, but rarely produces 2 nearly identical cracks in close proximity. The pattern points to intentional action. Someone struck this individual twice consecutively. The wounds are perimortem, occurring immediately before or during death. No signs of healing exist. Cranium 17 died directly from these blows. If this interpretation holds, it represents the earliest recorded homicide in Neanderthal lineage. 450,000 years ago, in the Middle Pleistocene, one individual killed another directly using a tool. Yet science remains cautious. Could it have been a falling rock in the cave? Analyzers rule out falling rocks. The angle of the fractures does not match bones broken by objects dropping from the cave ceiling, nor random damage typical of cave environments. The parallelism is too precise. Another possibility is an accident outside the cave, yet the evidence favors intent. When the same tool produces two identical injuries, one cannot ignore the notion of a deliberate strike. The Cima de los Huesos context complicates this further. The pit is not a natural dwelling. It lies at the bottom of a steep, difficult to-access shaft. Why so many skeletons accumulated there remains debated. One hypothesis suggests a natural trap. Another sees it as a place for depositing the dead, a form of early mortuary practice, far preceding known symbolic rituals. Regardless of interpretation, the presence of numerous individuals amplifies the violent death of cranium-17. The finding forces confrontation with an uncomfortable possibility. If this was homicide, what was the motive? Intro-group conflict, punishment for transgression, or sudden outbreak of violence? The answer remains forever absent. What is certain at that time? Neanderthals and their direct ancestors were capable of causing death within their own species through intentional action. Violence no longer came solely from predators or competition over carrion. It could arise within the community itself. The significance lies not only in a single skull, it lies in the fact that violence leaves lasting traces in the fossil record. Bones record trauma in ways oral storytelling cannot. Cranium-17, with two parallel fractures, is a confession etched in stone. It reminds us that Neanderthal history is not only about cooperation and care, but also about conflict and killing. The same species that could shelter the injured, as seen in healed fractures, could also kill a fellow human. Compassion and cruelty existed side by side, long before Homo sapiens appeared. Here, humility remains necessary. Calling this the first homicide is both compelling and risky, as the archaeological record is never complete. Older cases may exist, but are lost to time. What remains in Atapuerca is a rare preservation, a thin slice of history. This may be the earliest homicide we can clearly observe, but it is unlikely to have been the first occurrence. How far back such behavior extends remains unknown. What can be affirmed? By 450,000 years ago, the capacity to kill within the species existed in the Neanderthal lineage. And this opens a haunting question. Has violence ever truly been absent in human history? Or has it always existed, waiting to erupt when the fragile balance of cooperation collapses? Cranium-17 does not answer. But from the darkness of the pit of bones, it whispers that the Neanderthal story always held both light and shadow. What makes Cima de los Huesos particularly compelling is how it links violence with questions of community. To understand the strikes that ended Cranium-17's life, one must imagine the Neanderthal group around this individual. Neanderthal groups did not live in large populations. Each community likely consisted of only a few dozen individuals, mostly kin or survival units. In such a small group, the death of an individual could not go unnoticed. If the strikes to the skull were intentional, the entire community almost certainly knew. That awareness transforms the event into a valuable clue, showing that Neanderthal social structures could encompass violence. Killing was not only a physical act, but also a rupture in social order. The decision to bury the body deepens the mystery. If Cima de los Huesos truly represents intentional deposition of the dead, the community chose to place the murdered individual among others. Was this an early form of respect for the dead, or merely a convenient disposal? If respect, group cohesion extended even to someone killed violently. If convenience, it shows practical considerations could override moral hesitation. Either way, burial demonstrates that violence and belonging were not mutually exclusive in Neanderthal communities. An individual could fall to a fellow human, yet still receive burial. Compared to incidental injuries at other sites, the distinction is striking. Skull fractures from falls, predators, or natural post-burial deformation tend to scatter across regions. But Cranium 17 tells a different story. Too precise, overlapping strikes. The coincidence reveals not only intent, but skill. To strike twice in the same place, the attacker had to control force and position. This excludes random swinging. It is a targeted, calculated act. In other words, someone knew exactly what they were doing. This reveals a turning point. By the Middle Pleistocene, Neanderthals could carry out deliberate, lethal violence, less like accident, more like execution. Yet such evidence remains rare. If killing were common, many other remains would bear similar marks. Its scarcity shows it was exceptional, yet sufficient to demonstrate capability. Once a species crosses the threshold of intentional killing, the entire evolutionary picture changes. Beliefs must be negotiated. Rules, written or unwritten, become necessary. Cima de los Huesos is therefore important, not only for the tragic fate of a single individual, but also for the evolutionary threshold it represents. It shows that violence had been woven into Neanderthal history very early, long before cities, kingdoms, or armies. Organized warfare was unnecessary, only tools, intent, and a rupture in social cohesion. The haunting question remains: how did the Neanderthal community respond? Did they punish the killer, turn a blind eye, or develop the earliest principles of justice, something that no one can know today? We cannot answer. Yet the silence of the pit forces acknowledgement. In the deep shadows of time, both brutality and compassion existed within Neanderthal nature. When ancient human branches met, what occurred? Between roughly 300,000 and 200,000 years ago, Earth was not home to a single species. Early Homo sapiens had appeared in Africa. In Europe and Western Asia, Neanderthals gradually took shape, with thick skulls and robust bodies adapted to cold climates. Elsewhere, groups of Homo heidelbergenses still survived. At this time, the human family tree resembled a braided stream, splitting, reconnecting, and diverging again. Encounters left no writing, only traces on bones and tools. Many remains bear signs of violence. At Scheveningen, northern Germany, wooden spears, dating to around 300,000 years ago, were found, balanced and crafted for hunting large game such as horses. These tools demonstrate that Neanderthals and their relatives were skilled hunters, coordinating to bring down prey. Yet a spear capable of piercing a horse could also pierce human flesh. Some European sites contain Neanderthal remains, with injuries suggesting conflict among conspecific. A skull at Bodo, Ethiopia, shows a cut that may indicate defleshing after death. Its significance remains debated: ritual, cannibalism, or something else. The fact remains, tools were once placed upon human bones. By this stage, traces of violence became more common, reflecting a world in which conflict was not rare. At Shanadar Cave in Iraq, a Neanderthal rib shows a perforation consistent with a thrown spear. It could be a hunting accident or an attack. If it represents early evidence of tool-assisted killing, it marks a turning point. Violence was no longer limited to bare hands or stones, but involved crafted weapons designed to enhance force. Injuries on remains suggest more than isolated incidents. They indicate that nearby groups may have clashed. Territories, valleys, teeming with game, rivers rich with fish, were worth contesting. Population density remained low, yet groups still met at key resource points. Unlike later mass graves demonstrating organized massacres, here the evidence is scattered, hinting at sporadic encounters. Yet standing within arm's reach and thrusting a spear into another body represented. For Neanderthals, a decisive escalation in human violence. Traces on Neanderthal bones reveal planning, intent, and a willingness to risk retaliation. This was also a period marked by interbreeding among human populations. Genetic data show that Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens exchanged DNA long before the famous admixture event around 60,000 years ago. This means that encounters were not limited to conflict. Some encounters produced offspring with mixed ancestry. This duality is striking. A single meeting could lead to closeness or to injury. Some nights ended in flickering firelight around the hearth. Others ended with a spear piercing flesh. Survival during this period required walking a thin line between cooperation and conflict. Looking across overlapping time layers, one may wonder, were Neanderthals more violent than Homo sapiens? Was one human branch inherently more warlike? Archaeological evidence does not permit such simple conclusions. Injuries appear sporadically across sites and species. The common thread is not species difference, but the fragility inherent to all humans. Every group in Africa, Europe, or Asia lived in a perilous world, where a minor dispute could lead to death, and survival tools could easily become weapons. The haunting aspect of the evidence lies not in scale, but in proximity. Unlike later organized wars, Neanderthal violence was direct. A spear thrust required close range. A blow to the skull required direct contact. Violence was unmediated by distance. It was personal, immediate, and for survivors, the scars likely endured for life. Scars etched into bone and into memory. They shaped how a group viewed strangers, negotiated territory, and approached encounters with other groups. From this, the lesson becomes clear. Violence does not require large populations or armies to emerge. It requires only proximity, competition, and pre-existing hunting tools. Between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago, Neanderthals and other human groups learned to navigate both promise and peril in their interactions. Some meetings produced mixed descendants. Others left remains with pierced ribs, fractured skulls. The remaining question: were these encounters turning points in human nature? Did early killings plant seeds for later collective violence, or were they exceptions in a past largely governed by cooperation? The answer remains distant. Yet one thing is certain. From the moment humans held spears and faced both familiar and unfamiliar individuals, the potential for bloodshed existed. That potential followed into all subsequent eras. Fragmented bones raise questions. Ritual, hunger, or cruelty, between 160,000 and 100,000 years ago. Scattered Neanderthal remains across Europe left unsettling questions, never fully answered. Careful examination of some remains shows not only natural fractures or predator damage, but cuts, scrapes, and breakage patterns reminiscent of how Neanderthals processed animal bones. These are deliberate, systematic marks indicating the dismemberment of conspecific. The most haunting question: why? At Krapina, Croatia, early 20th century excavations uncovered a large collection of Neanderthal bones, dating to roughly 130,000 years ago. They belonged to dozens of individuals of varied age and sex, telling a complex story. Many fragments show cuts in locations consistent with muscle attachment. Some long bones were broken to extract marrow. Others were cracked as Neanderthals once did with animal bones. All this led many scholars to hypothesize cannibalism, possibly due to hunger or as a symbolic practice whose meaning remains obscure. At Moulagarki Cave in France, around 100,000 years ago, further evidence emerged. Remains of at least 6 Neanderthals show systematic defleshing. Cuts on skulls, ribs, and long bones match marks on butchered animal remains at the same site. In some cases, tongues were removed, long bones smashed for marrow, muscles separated with precision. It is difficult to deny the cannibalism hypothesis, yet the motive remains unclear. Hunger forcing consumption of corpses, or ritual in which eating human flesh carried symbolic meaning beyond our reconstruction. Ambiguity is key. Archaeology provides bones, not intent. Even if cannibalism occurred, it does not necessarily imply cruelty as we understand it. In many later cultures, processing the dead, even consuming parts, was not disrespect, but a form of remembrance, maintaining social bonds. It is possible those Neanderthals practiced a ritual with a completely different meaning: continuity, memory, or sustaining bonds after death. Adding complexity is evidence of care in Neanderthal society. At Shanadar, Iraq, one skeleton shows an individual who lost an arm, suffered severe facial injuries leading to blindness in one eye, and had arthritis in multiple joints, yet survived many years. This could only happen if the group provided care, protection, and support. Hands that once broke bones to extract marrow could also have nurtured, fed, and preserved life for the weak. This duality makes Neanderthals difficult to categorize in any simplistic framework. Remains at Krapina and Moligurki speak not only of violence, they tell a story of survival and choice, of desperation and cultural complexity. If cannibalism occurred during famine, it was necessity rather than cruelty. If it was ritual, it followed a symbolic logic foreign to us, yet likely profound to them. The fractures leave more questions than answers. Were these rare reactions to adversity, or part of regular Neanderthal life glimpsed only through fossil fragments? The fragmentary evidence suggests it was not an everyday practice. Finding such traces across distant lands, spanning hundreds of miles and thousands of years, shows that cannibalism, whatever its meaning, occurred repeatedly in Neanderthal history. For modern cultures that view such acts as deeply taboo, these discoveries are difficult to accept calmly and hard to separate from judgment. Yet setting aside modern prejudice, what emerges is not necessarily cruelty, but evidence of flexibility in how an ancient species responded to survival pressures and death. Injuries and broken bones may not be proof of savagery. They may be marks of hunger or part of a farewell ritual. The haunting questions remain, never fully closed. Looking at skeletons marked with cuts and fractures, it is unclear whether one faces cruelty or care. Did Neanderthals consume one another out of hunger, or process the dead according to a custom requiring bones to be broken and flesh separated? A definitive answer may never emerge. In this ambiguity lies a reminder: the behavior of ancient humans, even at its most unsettling, remained complex, tied to context, shaped by needs and beliefs that can only ever be partially understood. The world of Neanderthals, from 160,000 to 60,000 years ago, forms the backdrop of everything. Europe and Western Asia experienced repeated glacial cycles. Sparse forests vanished, icy steppes emerged, ecosystems shifted violently. Each environmental change could push an entire community to the brink of extinction. Large predatory animals, the backbone of hunting groups, could disappear from a region in just a few generations. Then, Neanderthal groups were forced to move, adapt, or vanish. In this context of scarcity, traces of bone cutting and meat removal appear less as aberrations than as responses to famine. Cuts at Krapina or Mullagerki, viewed in this context, may reflect environmental pressure more than cruelty. The possibility of intergroup conflict cannot be ignored. Even in a sparsely populated world, encounters among neighboring groups surely occurred. When resources were depleted, such meetings were rarely peaceful. If some cut bones belonged to defeated outsiders rather than group members, the boundary between survival and violence becomes even more blurred. Was this a practical use of enemy bodies, or a symbolic gesture marking victory? Archaeology cannot reveal intent, but it opens possibilities that remain unresolved. At some sites, patterns emerge. Certain body parts were consistently cut or removed more than others, suggesting culturally guided choices. Systematic skull fractures or selective removal of certain parts may relate to beliefs about the soul, the self, or the passage from life to death. Even if cannibalism occurred, it was not necessarily meant to humiliate. It could have been a transformation. And alongside this, formal burial sites existed. Bodies were placed in shallow graves, sometimes with grave goods or flowers. Neanderthals left two faces, the cuts on bones, and graves prepared with care. Such diversity resists labeling them simply as violent or compassionate. Ancient humans seemed capable of both extremes, much like their modern descendants. This duality has fueled debates to the present. What constitutes violence? What is ritual? And what is respect? Does dismembering a body always mean destruction, or could it be a form of care? Does consuming or separating the dead necessarily strip dignity, or might it represent reintegration into the community in another form? These questions go beyond archaeology, touching on how humans everywhere confront death. The lesson may not be to determine whether Neanderthals truly engaged in cannibalism, but to caution against projecting modern taboos onto the past. Bones tell us that flesh was taken, marrow eaten, bones broken. The reasons remain shrouded in shadow. Perhaps in that shadow, a truth appears. Humans have always lived on the edge of survival, intertwined with both violence and care, leaving traces that defy simplistic explanations. If war is often seen as a child of agriculture and cities, evidence from the late Ice Age challenges that notion. From 50,000 to 30,000 years ago, long before rice fields and domesticated herds, there is evidence that hunting-gathering groups sometimes hunted their own kind. The question arises, does organized human violence originate with agriculture, or from the moment ancient humans began seeing neighboring groups as competitors? The most haunting clues do not come from collapsed walls, but from bones themselves. At Shenidar Cave in Iraq, a Neanderthal skeleton was found with a pierced rib. The wound is consistent with a spear or projectile weapon passing through flesh and bone. The most striking detail is the angle and force, indicating intentional targeting rather than accident. Whether the result of a hunting mishap or a conflict, the fact remains, Neanderthals possessed tools for killing at a distance. That alone was a turning point. Killing from afar reduced risk, expanded ambush potential, and represents one of the silent revolutions of violence. Other sites provide additional evidence of early injuries. Skulls of similar age sometimes bear unhealed depressions, blows likely from combat. Hands and ribs show supporting fractures formed when an individual raised an arm to block a strike. These skeletons are silent witnesses to minor clashes, not community-wide annihilation, but sudden confrontations where bodies recorded both attack and defense. Scale remains small. No armies, no fortifications. Violence at that time was intimate, among small groups living at survival's edge, perhaps over water, game paths, or seasonal feeding grounds. In such a setting, a single moment could break bones, tear flesh, and etch history into the Neanderthal legacy. Encounters between groups could leave scars spanning generations. In the caves, gorges, and frozen valleys of Europe and Asia, a small ambush could reshape the fate of an entire community. Only a few individuals hidden in darkness, spears tipped with stone, could obliterate a neighboring group in an instant. Yet alongside traces of violence, archaeology reveals another aspect: the capacity for cooperation and creativity. Hands that once thrust stone-tipped spears at enemies also engraved Lapasiga cave walls, created strings of beads from bird claws, and experimented with social organization beyond small family units. Violence is only a single thread in the broader tapestry of Neanderthal existence. It does not define them entirely, but its presence is undeniable. The emergence of ranged weapons, lighter throwing spears, Mousterian points hafted to wooden shafts, allowed attacks from distance. A group blocking a valley entrance could rain down deadly points on intruders. From this, the balance of life and death shifted. The ambushed no longer had a chance to approach. Death could arrive before facing the opponent. This was no longer individual versus individual, but a collective tactic. The big question remains: can injuries on Neanderthal bones, fractured skulls, or pierced ribs be called war? Some scholars argue that war requires scale and organization. Yet Ice Age clashes were scattered, small-scale, arising from circumstance. Others emphasize that war is not about numbers, but intent when one group decides to treat another as an enemy. By that definition, evidence suggests war existed long before agriculture. Neanderthals, like other ancient human lineages, carried dual capacities, cooperating in novel ways while applying strategic thinking to violence against conspecifics. Perhaps war did not begin with crops or thrones, but from the moment a hunting group recognized another nearby, too close, too successful, or too threatening. On long, cold nights, memories of ambushes and the fallen likely reverberated beside the fire. Alongside memories of hunting and cave art, another subtle yet critical factor was movement. Neanderthal groups ranged widely, following reindeer, elk, and mammoth herds. Migration offered opportunities to avoid rivals, but also risked entering unfamiliar territories. Without common language, treaties, or often a second chance, when two groups converged on the same prey or riverbank, conflict could erupt immediately. Evidence of clashes extends beyond bones. Many Neanderthal occupation layers end abruptly, even when the environment remained unchanged. Hearths, Mousterian tools, shelters abandon, then centuries later, traces of another group appear. This suggests that a community may have been displaced or entirely wiped out. This was not conquest in the manner of later empires. Yet, in the scale of a few dozen individuals, the disappearance of a group equated to cultural extinction. Even tools bear traces. Meticulously crafted spears were not only for bringing down reindeer, but could pierce the bodies of other Neanderthals. The shift from thrusting spears to throwing spears indicates increasingly complex tactical thinking. Lighter weapons, longer range, allowed attacks without immediate counterattack. It is hard to avoid the conclusion that improvements originally aimed at hunting animals also made conflict among Neanderthals more lethal, like later humans. Oral memory may have escalated conflict. Stories of fallen kin or narrowly escaped ambushes, repeated beside the fire, turned outsiders into a constant threat. Suspicion was passed down, forming a layer of communal memory. Violence, then, was not merely a product of agriculture or rulership. It is as ancient as a Mousterian stone, as persistent as the need to protect kin and territory. The Neanderthal hunter, hidden with a spear in a mountain crevice, embodied the essence of a warrior. Yet another layer of evidence shows parallel complexity. Perhaps ornaments, mineral pigments, and engravings established the boundaries of us and others. Beads made from eagle claws, red pigment on bones, or abstract engravings on cave walls were more than decoration. They were signs of identity, of differentiation. Around 50,000 to 40,000 years ago in Europe, gathering points appeared. Multiple Neanderthal groups would converge seasonally. Exchanges of mates, hunting knowledge, or rare materials may have occurred. In a world rarely encountering strangers, these gatherings made the concept of outsiders more familiar. In this context, markers of distinction became essential. Beads, pendants, pigments small, yet heavy with meaning. They did not merely beautify. They conveyed to others which group one belonged to. Red ochre on Neanderthal skin was not mere decoration. It was a marker, a declaration. I belong to the group from that valley. Beaded strings of perforated eagle claws found in Croatia show connections between widely separated groups. Pat Shipman and other scholars have described this as the first invention of color, not in the sense of painting, but as a way communities used imagery to signify identity, much like flags or military insignia later would. When all members wore similar beads or the same streak of pigment, banners became unnecessary. For the first time in prehistoric Europe and Asia, one could instantly discern whether the individual before them belonged to us or another group. This had consequences for violence. Once visual markers existed, trust or suspicion occurred immediately. Previously, a stranger had to signal, negotiate, or spend days to prove intent. Now, a single string of beads or a streak of red could carry a message. It might signal safe or caution in an icy world, where reindeer meat and roots were scarce. Clarity could save lives, but also harden boundaries. Archaeological evidence from Cueva de los Aviones, Spain, with shells dyed red and yellow, shows how far Neanderthals pushed this expressive system in other caves. From France to Italy, ground ochre showed smoothing, suggesting it was powdered for application to skin or bones. At La Pasiga, abstract engravings and drawings over 60,000 years old reveal symbolic thinking thought, connected to imagery and identity. Taken together, these artifacts indicate that around 50,000 to 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals entered a new social world. A world in which belonging was not only based on kinship, but displayed outwardly, recognized publicly. This was not organized warfare, yet it laid the groundwork. As group identity became visible, boundaries became clearer. Violence could erupt not only from chance encounters, but from opposing symbols. An individual wearing the wrong beads, or none at all, may have had no chance to explain. Yet these early markers should not be mistaken for modern nationalism. They were not imperial flags or military uniforms. They were silent, intimate markers, handmade within families, potentially passed from parents to children, but accumulated over generations and repeated gatherings. Awareness of our people and their people deepened. Here lies the root of human psychology, the readiness to defend symbols, even with blood. Contradiction always persisted. Did ornaments and pigments pave the way for violence or for peace? At winter gathering points, where multiple Neanderthal groups shared reindeer meat or flint, they likely helped reduce conflict. When identity was clear, misunderstandings were easier to avoid. A string of beads could convey, "I come from the valley nearby, where fire and meat are still shared." Here, symbols were not weapons but treaties carried on the body. Yet clarity also focused resentment. When resources dwindled, the line between ornament and target could blur. As often seen in Neanderthal archaeology, the result left only two possibilities: cooperation or conflict. Symbols may have been the earliest means for Neanderthals to expand community beyond kin, but they also sowed division, us and them seeds that could grow into suspicion, then into violence. Beads from eagle claws, dyed shells, or engraved cave marks from 40,000 years ago mark the beginning of a story never fully ending. The effort to extend the circle of us before it became a pretext for confrontation. Thus, the question remains: when Neanderthals first strung eagle claws and painted skin with ochre, did they invent broad cooperation or sow the seeds of early warfare? Archaeological evidence, such as Shanidar, Iraq, where multiple Neanderthal skeletons show both healed and fresh injuries, reveals a dark reality. This was not a single battle, but repeated conflict over generations. Injuries to skulls, ribs, and vertebrae indicate multiple individuals struck by weapons, sometimes from behind, implying ambush rather than frontal confrontation. Other skeletons show prolonged care. Disabled individuals survived years before death, evidence of cooperation. Yet stone points still pierced bones, a reminder that violence was always present at Saint César, France. A Neanderthal skeleton bears trauma consistent with spear shape. At El Sidrón, Spain, evidence suggests violence may have extended to cannibalism. These findings depict a dual world, communal, cooperative, yet also ambushing and destructive, in icy landscapes where food and fuel were scarce. Isolated groups were sometimes forced together. In such circumstances, minor differences in game herds, hunting grounds, or river crossings could spark clashes. Conflict, therefore, involve not just individuals but entire communities. Archaeological evidence shows the rate of violent injury among Neanderthals was far higher than among contemporary predatory animals. This suggests violence was part of existence, alongside art, cooperation, and identity. Many cases show individuals attacked from behind ambush, rather than direct confrontation. Multiple instances exhibit both healed and new wounds, indicating repeated conflict, not single moments. Neanderthals lived in a world where suspicion, symbolism, and violence intertwined, like three threads in the same fabric of survival. What makes Neanderthal sites crucial for understanding ancient human violence is how they bridge survival, instincts, and social structures. These skeletons, from the late Middle to Upper Pleistocene, when the Ice Age blanketed Europe, showed that collective conflict was not a late product of agriculture or states, but existed among hunting-gathering groups, disputing hunting grounds, fire sources, or dwellings. This was not warfare in the sense of armies or generals. Yet 4 individuals struck through the skull by a spear or with fractured occipital bones. Such distinctions mattered little. Notably, many critically injured individuals were still buried, not abandoned. Someone dug a grave in frozen ground, placed the remains, sometimes with stones, pollen, or tools. This opens haunting questions. Did the surviving group truly take the effort to commemorate immediately after an ambush? Was burial a form of communal memory, or a bond to strengthen the group against future threats? If so, Neanderthal cemeteries were not only records of violence, but also reflections of endurance, and the most unsettling aspect, their ordinariness. A child's skull shattered by impact is horrifying to us. But in the Neanderthal world, it may have been familiar. In the frozen landscape, maturity was not only about hunting giant deer or gathering roots, but also surviving wounds from sudden attacks at the riverbank, or a spear thrust into the camp. Those cemeteries were filled with bodies, not only elders who had completed life cycles, but young individuals robbed of their future. What should this be called? Some scholars see it as the earliest evidence of communal warfare. Others are more cautious, labeling it persistent raids, scattered conflicts. Labels matter less than understanding that, for Neanderthals, violence was not an isolated accident. It had become a survival structure, and as with all prehistory, caution is required. No one knows the attacker's motive, nor whether today's victim was yesterday's aggressor. There were no narratives, only bones marked with scars, silent yet eloquent, cracked skulls at La Ferrassi, piles of bones at Krapina, spear points through ribs at Shenada. All testify that violence was part of that living world. Was this the first battlefield? Perhaps not in the sense understood later, but certainly evidence that a community endured repeated injuries while still commemorating the fallen Shenada. Krapina La Ferrassi site is both a record of conflict and a cemetery. Here, the origins of violence were recorded not in writing, but in stone blades lodged in bones. The most haunting question is not, was this the first war? But, was this where a community embedded violence into memory, into identity, making it intertwined with daily existence? If so, the line between past and present is thinner than imagined. Why did Neanderthals kill entire families? Perhaps clashes arose over hunting grounds, contested paths, or caves. Yet some excavations suggest no one was spared. No children, no elders. Neanderthal violence did not leave large-scale scenes, like Nataruk, later among Homo sapiens. But evidence still points to cruelty. A skull shattered by a fatal blow, a body bearing repeated wounds, as if the goal was not merely to drive off, but to annihilate entirely. Caves and shelters, defending against cold and predators, could also become battlegrounds. Water-rich locations or lush river meadows could sustain a group and also attract another. When two parties met, the outcome was sometimes not negotiation, but bloodshed. Burials were not always performed. Some corpses were left where they fell, broken bones stacked in sediments. Others were collected, placed in pits, sometimes sprinkled with pollinace at Shenada. This difference suggests multiple layers of meaning, fear, ritual, or attempts to preserve memory. Some individuals appear to have endured repeated trauma, fractured arm bones multiple times. Some died while pregnant. Death targeted not only strong hunters, but the most fragile bodies. This was not only conflict over food or territory, but systematic destruction of a group. Why such cruelty among communities still hunting and gathering? One hypothesis attributes it to Pleistocene climate shifts, retreating ice, parched steppes, groups clashing in a struggle for habitable land. Another hypothesis suggests violence was not only aimed at resources, but at bloodlines. If an attacking group seized young women and eliminated remaining individuals, this was not merely competition for survival, but also genetic appropriation, a way to ensure the lineage of the victors. The thought is chilling. Long before written history, Neanderthals may have known a dark biological strategy, later called lineage cleansing. It forces recognition of a stark reality. Organized collective violence did not wait for agriculture or states. It was already embedded in prehistoric social structures, in Pleistocene caves, where fire flickered and icy winds swept through entrances. Neanderthals endured massacres often associated with civilizations. This makes Neanderthal sites unique. They are not only traces of physical evolution, but also evidence of conflict. It is easy to label attackers as monsters, but in doing so, a greater lesson is missed. These individuals shared morphology and cognitive capacity with their peers. Violence did not arise from absolute difference, but from the capacity to manipulate survival structures. Neanderthal communities may have once gathered around fires, shared food, passed on skills, even produced simple tones still recognizable today. Yet, when fear, scarcity, or territorial disputes escalated, violence appeared, leaving deep marks in bones. What emerges is not that Neanderthals were predestined for violence, but that the capacity existed, waiting for environmental pressure or competition to trigger it. Archaeologists continue to debate: were fractures in Neanderthal bones at Cima de los Huesos or Shanidar hunting accidents, or evidence of intergroup combat? Some suggest that when forests, large prey, or caves became limited, removing rivals could provide survival advantage. Others emphasize that in most Neanderthal sites, direct evidence of violence is scarce, indicating conflict was not constant yet. The archaeological record cannot be denied. Many Neanderthal skeletons in Europe bear fatal spear wounds, blunt force injuries, or crushed skulls. The chilling reality: Neanderthals understood the logic of annihilation. Killing one opponent is one thing, but when children's skulls also show violence, the desire to eliminate enemies completely existed very early. These injuries reflect not random collisions, but calculation, fear, desire for resources, and cold precision in choice, complex motivations still present in today's violence, and the silence of skeletal remains buried in sediments. Only one question remains: if even small Neanderthal groups could attack and annihilate each other, what does this say about the fragility of peace in later human communities? Over 100,000 years ago, Europe's climate was in constant flux. Ice melted and returned, steppes expanded and shrank. Valleys rich in game or water could become depleted within a season. In this context, even minor climatic shifts could turn shelters into contested grounds. For Neanderthals, survival was not just hunting, but anticipating migration seasons, the movement of herds. A cave with abundant firewood near water could attract multiple groups. Once occupied, newcomers had to decide, negotiate, share, or fight. Fractured bones and spear points lodged in Neanderthal skeletons indicate that sometimes the choice turned to blood. Ambiguity always existed. Perhaps a traveling group paused in a cave, then was ambushed by another. In that scenario, violence was not just territorial defense, but opportunistic strike seizing food, weapons, or even women, while erasing survivors to prevent retaliation. Tools tell the rest of the story. Mouse-Terrian blades found embedded in bones indicate finely crafted weapons, sometimes of non-local, stone suggesting long-distance movement. Networks of exchange and also conflict reaching far. Some Neanderthal sites show corpses left where they fell, unburied, without ritual. This was not only indifference, but possibly a statement. Refusal to bury denied dignity. Leaving bones exposed to earth and predators was a symbolic act, aimed at erasing the memory of the enemy. In this way, the Neanderthal world reveals recurring patterns. Violence was not only meant to destroy, but also to humiliate and erase. Are these traces merely anomalies of harsh periods, or part of the nature of Neanderthal society? The question remains open. Yet, from shattered skeletons, archaeologists recognize that even before Homo sapiens appeared in Europe, the tension between peace and violence had already marked evolutionary history. Neanderthal groups were sometimes wiped out systematically. Some communities disappeared in a single event across glacial Europe. Archaeological evidence reveals mass grave sites where entire populations were eliminated not by nature, but by the hands of fellow humans in one pit. Archaeologists discovered more than 24 Neanderthal individuals, cracked skulls, shattered leg bones. These injuries were not caused by collapsing soil or post-burial disturbance. They are traces of deliberate violence, blows struck to annihilate. Some hypotheses suggest attackers intentionally maimed victims as a form of control or humiliation, ensuring that those who fell would never rise again in life or in concept of death. Among the victims were not only strong men. The bones of women and children were also present, indicating that this was not a fair fight, but a complete raid to erase an entire community. Unlike other nomadic hunting groups, some Neanderthal communities remained attached to caves, mountain passes, or lands with stable game and fresh water. This permanence made retreat difficult when attacked. Thus, when conflict erupted, the outcome was often annihilation rather than escape. In some places, evidence goes further. One site reveals over 500 Neanderthal remains, placed in long pits surrounding habitation areas. The bones bear strange processing. Many skulls were smashed, long bones split to extract marrow, and some cranial caps were ground into bowl-like shapes. Alongside the bones, stone tools from distant regions appear, suggesting these individuals were brought from afar. What happened remains unresolved. Some hypotheses interpret this as evidence of cannibalistic ritual, where victims were killed and consumed. Others suggest that bone modification carried symbolic meaning akin to sacrifice. Whatever the case, these burial pits show that the Neanderthal world was not just small hunting groups in cold forests, but a context of violent rituals and organized massacres. A broader perspective reveals a pattern for millennia. Neanderthal communities in Europe faced the constant threat of sudden annihilation by fellow humans. These were times of scarce resources, long winters, dwindling game. Groups shared the same territory, rivers, and migrating herds. Survival margins were so fragile that a few miles of hunting ground could determine life or death. Sites indicate that many communities dug trenches, built obstacles, or chose deep caves to shelter from potential attacks. Population pressure may have been a factor. When numbers in a region exceeded available food, competition turned to violence. Territorial disputes erupted, and a few rich hunting valleys could become the starting point for annihilation. Unlike small groups that could retreat, stable communities could not easily abandon their dwellings. When conflict erupted, the result was not only the loss of a few individuals, but the possible eradication of an entire lineage. The bones of children in mass graves indicate that the purpose was not victory, but the elimination of a line. This evokes a primitive concept of war, though it is unclear whether Neanderthals conceptualized it as organized. Perhaps these were repeated raids, motivated by revenge, scarcity, or cycles of hatred. Yet when the outcome was the disappearance of entire communities, the boundary between raid and war became blurred. Some evidence suggests that violence was not only practical but also bone treatment, shaping cranial bowls, or transporting bodies from afar to a common cycle, hint at lost beliefs and systems of meaning. Were the slain considered enemies consumed to absorb power? Or were they sacrifices meant to bond the group? The answer remains unclear, and this very ambiguity gives weight to the sites. They force modern humans to recognize that the roots of violence are not only hunger or competition, but intertwined with belief and ritual. Neanderthal mass graves remind us that violence leaves more enduring marks than peace. Fires, tools, or shelters may vanish, but cracked skulls persist. The dense concentration of violent sites indicates something in the Neanderthal world that both strengthened community bonds and drove groups into cycles of mutual destruction. We may never know the story of each individual, but the remaining bones confront us with reality. Neanderthal survival was not only fire and tools, but also territory and blood. It may have been the attachment to land that sowed the notion that some groups, some lineages, had to disappear for others to persist. And so, the haunting question remains: did Neanderthal evolution, the ability to hunt collectively, to share dwellings, bind them together, or grant them new, terrible reasons to kill? A frozen Neanderthal corpse in an icy cave, bearing a stone spear wound, suggests that these conflicts were not hypothetical. It is tangible evidence, showing that violence marked the very last moments of existence. The body lay within cave sediment, covered by earth, rubble, and time. The skull was cracked, bearing the imprint of a strong blow from a hard object. Ribs were broken, injuries that could not heal on their own. Archaeologists initially considered it an accident of falling rock from the cave ceiling, but closer inspection revealed fractures with direct, sharp, and deliberate force. Death came from violence, not predators, not hunger or cold. This is evidence of an attack. The body belonged to a Neanderthal, a member of a Pleistocene hunting and gathering group. Around the corpse were Mousterian stone tools, flint points, and animal bones chopped for marrow. The individual once wore a tightly sewn animal hide cloak. Charcoal and fire traces remained in the cave. This was no ineffectual being. The individual belonged to a community capable of tool-making, fire management, hunting deer, aurochs, and woolly rhinoceros. Yet death did not come from the harsh environment, but from the hand of another of its kind. Analysis of teeth shows a metric diet, sometimes supplemented with seeds and roots, where patterns indicate chewing animal hide for softening. But the bones bore many old injuries. Healed fractures a testament to a life full of encounters. In the final days, the body received a direct blow to the skull. This was no hunting accident, but a fatal wound. Some hypotheses suggest intra-group conflict over prey, territory, or hierarchy. Others propose confrontation with another Neanderthal group on the frozen plain at Nadar. Another individual was buried with a rib wound, suggesting a spear strike. At Cima de los Huesos, a Neanderthal ancestor's skull bears to parallel fractures evidence of deliberate violence. These indicate that death at the hands of a fellow was not isolated. The angles of fractures and breaks show these were not accidental falls. The blows were direct or close range. The killer was not a predator. It was another Neanderthal. After the strike, death came swiftly, but the motive remains obscure. Was it intra-group rivalry, a failed hunt, or competition between two groups over the same hunting ground? Stone tools remained, animal bones lay nearby, no signs of looting. This indicates the purpose was not property, but death itself, removal, rather than acquisition. In Neanderthal life, violence could arise from scarcity, disputes over hunting territory, or internal conflict. A major battle was unnecessary. A single grievance could lead to a fatal outcome. This body provides a different perspective on Neanderthals. Not only skilled hunters, not only creatures adapted to the ice, but beings carrying conflict and violence within. Unlike the late Neolithic mass graves at Talheim, here there is no evidence of large-scale slaughter, only a single death. Yet the intensity still evokes brutality. Personal violence, ambush, or revenge all fell within the scope of prehistory. Modern analysis allows a partial reconstruction of the last meal. Venison, animal fat, sometimes traces of charred seeds stuck in the teeth. The bones show signs of arthritis and wear, evidence of a life of harsh labor. There are no indications of wealth or status-only existence amid the cold, ending in violence. This death does not present a legendary warrior, but a Neanderthal with a weary body, aching joints, and an attacker. Ambiguity remains. Was this murder or a form of primitive warfare? The boundary is blurred in prehistory. The body serves as proof that 70,000 years ago, on icy plains, Neanderthals killed one another with stone tools and strength, with clear intent. A single individual, a cracked skull, is enough to open a window into prehistoric violence. This is a rare glimpse of a single death, but with significant meaning. Hunted like prey, betrayed by kin. We will never know. Yet that skeleton forces recognition. Violence was part of Neanderthal life. If the individual could speak, would it call its death war, murder, or something else? Whatever the answer, the spear, stone fragments, and blow leave an enduring truth. Violence ran like an undercurrent through the evolution of ancient humans. Intentional traces of violence occurred not only within a group, but also targeted neighboring communities. Discoveries in a cave in northern Spain blurred the line that modern humans once drew between themselves and ancient ancestors. Cranium 17 at Cima de los Huesos, with 2 symmetrical blows to the forehead, is the oldest evidence of homicide in the lineage leading to Neanderthals. Since the 1970s, excavations at Atapuerca revealed accumulations of dozens of skeletons, many bearing severe injuries, both recent and healed. These fragments gradually form a picture. Pre-Neanderthal and Neanderthal groups experienced not only hunting, but organized conflict. Not random wounds from predators, but direct blows, cuts made with Maustrian tools. Initially, fractures appeared faint. Within the same area, traces of different groups overlapped. One group settled near water, another controlled, sparse forest. Over time, boundaries became clearer. Communities that once shared hunting grounds now divided into distinct territories. In Central Europe and the Balkans, excavation sites such as Krapina record dozens of injured Neanderthals, many with broken skulls and long bones. These are not isolated accidents, but repeated events where communities, separated by space and resources, faced tragic outcomes in survival. A Neanderthal group advancing into another territory did not go alone. Long wooden spears over 2 meters in Schickningen suggest coordinated ambush. When an individual strayed from the group and encountered a larger opponent, the result was often brutal. Cracked skulls, broken ribs, spears piercing the chest cavity. After such encounters, only the skeleton remained buried in sediment. Over tens of thousands of years, the pattern repeated. Some bodies bore injuries that could not heal. Others disappeared from their living areas. Healed bone scars show that some survived severe wounds, but many did not. The focus of systematic attacks was always on adults, the main strength of the group. When these individuals were removed, the opposing community weakened. Stronger groups took over hunting grounds, resources, and sometimes Neanderthal females from the defeated group. Small populations gradually disappeared, while dominant groups expanded. These ambushes were not spontaneous. Fracture patterns on multiple individuals indicate coordination, precise strikes, and overwhelming tactics. Hardly any evidence exists that the victorious group suffered similar losses. Only the defeated left traces of obliteration. The scale of violence astonishes archaeologists. These were not skirmishes, but organized campaigns. Initially, many scholars were skeptical. Perhaps the injuries were collisions with large game. Perhaps rockfalls or hunting accidents caused them. But when evidence from multiple caves Laferisi, Shenada, Krapina revealed the same pattern, skepticism gradually faded. Over subsequent decades, similar patterns continued to emerge. Spear thrusts into pelvis and shoulder bones, shattered skulls from direct blows. These indicate repeated conflicts, far from rare, and the main cause, territory, water sources, shelters, and migrating herds. By eliminating opponents, a Neanderthal group could expand its range, claim more prey, more roots, more shelter. Females from the defeated group could be incorporated, expanding reproductive opportunity. Violence, in this case, was not random. It became a survival strategy, rewarded with land and lineage. Thus, skeletons at Cima de los Huesos and Krapina become mirrors of our knees. Here, not only the skill of Mousterian tools is revealed, but also the capacity for alliance in violence. Individuals combine strength to achieve what a lone individual could not. Attacks were calculated, timing selected, and the weaker eliminated at their most vulnerable. These were not spontaneous accidents. These were coordinated killings, reflecting the roots of human warfare. The details are grim. A Krapina skull shows multiple sequential cuts to the head. A Shanadar individual died young, pierced through the chest by a spear. Such archaeological records shocked many researchers. For a long time, Neanderthals were imagined primarily as resilient hunters of the ice. But to see them strike one another with wooden spears and stone, delivering fatal blows, was a profound and unsettling discovery. Evolutionary biologists quickly grasped the implication. If a Neanderthal group, without metal weapons or long-term settlements, still engaged in lethal raids, then organized violence must have emerged very early. Long before agricultural states arose, this view suggests that killing neighbors was not an invention of Mesopotamia, but a primate-derived heritage evident in Neanderthals. Intergroup violence, rather than mere misfortune, became an ancient adaptive strategy, securing territory and reproductive opportunities. Demographic research indicates that individuals participating in successful raids left more offspring, benefiting from abundant food and safe shelter. Violence, in this case, served as a selective mechanism, but caution is needed. Neanderthals were not modern humans, and modern humans are not merely repeating Neanderthal patterns. Ecological and cultural factors still determined outcomes. Neanderthals lived in harsh glacial environments, with seasonally migrating game and scattered food. Small, dispersed group structures allowed ambushes to occur during chance encounters. Later, modern humans developed wider cooperative networks, with technology and culture altering the entire calculation. Thus, Neanderthal killings do not prove war as destiny, only that potential for coalition violence existed deep in ancestral heritage. This reality reveals a paradox. The same capacity for cooperation that allowed Neanderthals to hunt together, share food, and care for one another also opened the way to collective violence. This dark fragment, buried deep in fossilized bone, testifies that the roots of war did not begin in metal city-states, but in icy caves, where traces of Neanderthals remain etched in shattered bones. Do lethal injuries on Neanderthal bones explain patterns in the archaeological record? Spear punctures in ribs, clusters of cranial trauma. Mass graves such as Jebel Sahaba or Natara Crater, but resonant with the same question. Did the roots of collective violence arise not from agriculture or statehood, but far earlier, embedded in the very existence of ancient human lineages? There is no definitive answer, but evidence shows that organized killing was not merely a cultural product. It could arise from biology, from the pressures of glacial environments, from competition over resources, and from social dynamics within small hunting groups. Studies of skulls and injuries serve as reminders that Neanderthals carried within them both the capacity for cooperation and the seeds of violence. Communities marked by ambushes and killings were also communities that shared fire, divided hunted meat, and buried their dead with care. Violence was part of them, but not the whole story. Perhaps the deepest lesson preserved in the rocky shelters and skeletal remains is this: brutality and care are not two separate worlds. They intertwine, even within the same individual. A warrior bearing spear wounds might also have cradled an infant or shared dried meat with companions. The capacity to nurture and to destroy existed side by side. And in modern humans, it is no different. The haunting question never fades. If Neanderthal groups once ambushed neighbors to contest hunting grounds, firewood, or mates, how much of human history is simply a continuation of that legacy? And if coalition violence existed so early, could it ever be erased, or only restrained? The question of the origin of violence runs alongside the question of the potential to transcend it. While many sites show traces of conflict, there is also evidence of Neanderthal societies built on cooperation. Groups living in valleys rich with game and wild plants left remains with few injuries. They crafted tools together, shared caves, and maintained social bonds. The most striking feature of Neanderthals was not just their robust build or massive skulls, but social organization. Some groups were dominated by male competition contests for hunting, authority, and access to mates. Elsewhere, Burial evidence and care for disabled individuals suggests the importance of cooperation and even alliances among females. These bonds could help curb intragroup violence, maintain order without a single individual dominating through force. Social position often depended not only on muscle power, but on kinship, family status, and the ability to share resources. This created distinct variations between Neanderthal communities. When conflicts arose, some groups resorted to violence. In other places, disputes were mitigated by sharing fire, food, or temporarily splitting the group to reduce tension. Comparisons of archaeological sites show that not all communities were alike. Some bear traces of bloodshed, others traces of cooperation. These differences are both evolutionary and social. In many communities, death from violence was low, while in regions with intense competition over resources, injury rates were far higher. Death by violence was not inevitable, but a reflection of environmental conditions. Infanticide, common in some primates, shows no clear evidence in Neanderthal records. On the contrary, many children's remains were carefully buried. Yet adult violent stabbings, cuts, blunt force injuries left unmistakable marks. Why did Neanderthal communities differ? Geography offers part of the explanation. Regions rich in game and firewood allowed groups to maintain relative peace. In harsh areas, with long winters and scarce food, competition easily turned to violence. Ecology shaped society, as it has for many species. In fertile valleys, Neanderthals could maintain larger, tightly connected groups. In cold, resource-scarce environments, smaller groups faced each other more directly, compelled to defend vital resources. This contrast reveals that their social organization was flexible, not uniform. Family structure played a role as well. Evidence of long-term care for injured or sick individuals suggests that solidarity could limit internal violence. Conversely, in groups with weaker bonds, aggression erupted more easily in this way. Neanderthals demonstrate that order could be maintained not only through force, but also through alliances and care. Yet their world was not ideal. Disputes, competition, and exclusion persisted only. The degree and consequences varied. Researchers often note that Neanderthals were both fierce and socially connected. They roared in battle, yet whispered in burial rituals. From an evolutionary perspective, they were both a warning and a hope. If Neanderthal violence illustrates the dark legacy of humanity, they also demonstrate the capacity to overcome it through cooperation. Both aspects coexisted, and both are deeply imprinted in the heritage of Homo sapiens. Violence can be deeply ingrained, but not inevitable. The archaeological record of Neanderthals reminds us that humans can choose a different path through bonding, through cooperation, through making survival rely not only on killing, but also on sharing. From this emerges an ongoing debate about human nature, between unavoidable violence and the possibility of constructing a more enduring society. For a long time, Neanderthals were seen mainly through the lens of violence. Cracked skulls at Cima de los Huesos, pierced ribs at Krapina, or eye socket trauma at La Ferricial seemed to tell only of collisions and bloodshed. But archaeology has broadened this view. At Shenada, in the Zagros Mountains, a Neanderthal lost part of an arm, had deformed ribs and a fractured skull, yet survived for many years. Such survival could only have been possible through care, food sharing, and protection by the group. Pollen found near the burial hints that Neanderthals may have even acknowledged death with attention, yet the entire Neanderthal lineage disappeared roughly 40,000 years ago. With that extinction, a vivid testament vanished that humans were not unique in the blend of aggression and cooperation. In the remaining Neanderthal bones, traces of violence and of mutual aid exist side by side, like two opposing rhythms in a single epic. Delving deeper, scientists look to biology. The Neanderthal brain, larger than the average Homo sapiens, with developed parietal lobes and motor control areas, suggests complex hunting coordination, but also the potential for organized conflict. Many skulls bear blows from Mousterian stone weapons, showing that violence was not mere accident, but could be repeated behavior. Genetic studies reveal that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens shared many variants affecting serotonin and dopamine neurotransmitters involved in impulse control. There is no single warrior gene, but the combination of genes and brain structures suggests that Neanderthal aggression was influenced by biology. As complex as in modern humans, another question arises: where did Neanderthal violence fall on the evolutionary spectrum? Analysis of bones shows high injury rates, comparable to later prehistoric warriors. Yet the survival of severely injured individuals demonstrates that community care was also essential. Aggression and cooperation, conflict and solidarity coexisted within the same bloodline. This leads to a hypothesis. Neanderthals survived the ice not only through hunting or tools, but through an evolutionary balance between violence and social cohesion. Aggression protected territory, cohesion kept the group intact. This balance, ultimately, was insufficient to withstand harsh climate shifts and competition from Homo sapiens. Yet in the remaining sediment, the story of Neanderthals whispers on human evolution was built not only on war, not only on compassion, but on the enduring tension between the two. Only in certain environmental contexts. In Neanderthals, violence did not appear as a straight line from gene to behavior, but as a network woven between biological structure, social groups, and the harsh landscapes of the Ice Age. This raises a haunting question. Did Neanderthals carry in their DNA a deep-seated streak of aggression, predetermining the lineage toward violent impulses? Or was cooperation in hunting, food sharing, and group norms sufficient to restrain that tendency? Fossils suggest both: bones with weapon-inflicted injuries, yet also bones that healed after severe trauma, evidence of collective care. This implies that even if Neanderthal DNA contained the potential for aggression, social structure from small hunting parties to cave-dwelling bands could channel or control it. Genes roll the dice, but environment, ice, and scarcity cast the throw. Here, interpretation becomes delicate. When linking heredity to aggressive behavior, caution is needed to avoid confusing correlation with causation, or turning biology into an excuse for violence. Archaeology once took a reductive view, treating Neanderthals as born warriors, but modern findings are more modest. They acknowledge that genes and brain physiology have influence, yet insist that no single variant explains the full spectrum of behavior from intra-group conflict to cooperation in large game hunting. These phenomena are far more complex, tied to ecological conditions, fluctuating climates, resource scarcity, and small-scale social structures. If anything, Neanderthal genetic research highlights flexibility. Within the DNA exists the potential for violence, alongside the potential for empathy and social bonding. Whether aggression dominates depends not only on genes, but on social frameworks, bands relying on each other for survival, The same biological apparatus could generate conflict under scarcity, yet also produce endurance, decisiveness, or protection in different circumstances. So, is violence encoded in Neanderthal DNA? In part, yes. But alongside that is the capacity for cooperation. What genes reveal is not destiny, but flexibility. Neanderthals were animals molded by hundreds of thousands of years of natural selection, yet also beings capable of tool-making and building social structures to regulate impulses. Aggressive genes whisper they do not command. The story of Neanderthals is not whether violence existed in DNA, but whether groups could direct it toward hunting, defense, or allow it to erupt in intragroup conflict. Modern genetic evidence shows that roughly 2% of Neanderthal DNA persists in Homo sapiens. These variants relate to immunity, metabolism, and even temperament. There is no single violent gene, but a complex link between harsh environments and biological heritage, rendering Neanderthals a multi-layered picture rather than a simple stereotype. The lesson is clear. No one is predetermined by DNA. Genes can tip the scales, but circumstances decide. A Neanderthal individual could become a leading hunter or fall in a dispute, depending on social and environmental conditions. For science, this confirms that understanding Neanderthal aggression requires examining both strands, genes, and environment intertwined like a braid. For us, perhaps the lesson is simpler. No species is born purely violent, nor entirely immune to it. Within Neanderthal groups, the status of adult males often determined reproductive access. Archaeologists have recorded broken or deformed juvenile bones, suggesting some young individuals may have died from causes other than accidents. Some anthropologists interpret this as evidence of intra-group competition, where newly dominant males could pose risks to juveniles lacking direct kinship. The reproductive cycle continued, favoring genetic advantages of those assuming leadership. For a long time, this hypothesis was considered bold, since Neanderthals were often pictured as cooperative hunters, sharing food and burying the dead. Yet growing evidence forces researchers to consider that violence targeting juveniles may not have been random, but part of strategic behavior within the species. What about Neanderthals specifically? Did this lineage share harsh evolutionary patterns similar to other primates? Infant remains are rare, as small bones preserve poorly. However, some sites show unusual juvenile mortality rates, raising questions about selective decisions within the community. In the harsh conditions of the Ice Age, where food, shelter, and energy to raise a child were demanding, a newborn in unfavorable circumstances might be considered a burden. Some scientists suggest stepfathers or unrelated males could exert pressure to eliminate juveniles. This model aligns with evolutionary logic observed in many species, though difficult to accept. Neanderthals, like later Homo sapiens, were not separate from fundamental biological drives. Infanticide could occur due to resource scarcity, kinship hierarchies, or group structures prioritizing individuals with clear genetic advantages. Some European sites show infants buried at settlement edges, unlike adult burials, possibly reflecting different valuations of early life. In modern hunter-gatherer comparisons, closely spaced births sometimes cannot all be raised simultaneously. A situation Neanderthals may also have faced. These practices do not precisely match those of monkeys or lions, but they suggest Neanderthals confronted similar biological decisions. maintaining the strongest lineage in a brutal environment. Asterisk if gene survival is the ultimate measure, removing rival offspring or reducing burdens from newborns in poor conditions becomes an extreme strategy. Individuals carrying this tendency leave a genetic mark. Those without it may leave fewer descendants. Yet this is not fate. Counter-strategies could exist. Neanderthal groups sometimes show evidence of broad cooperation, sharing food, caring for the weak or disabled. This indicates that drives to eliminate and to protect coexisted within the same species. For Neanderthals, a major difference from other animals was the development of rudimentary social rules. Evidence of burials and long-term care for disabled individuals shows a network of relations beyond immediate genetic interests. This reveals a complex picture. Alongside biological pressures potentially leading to infant abandonment, there was also an instinct to bond and protect. This ambiguity mirrors human evolution itself, always oscillating between violence and nurturing. Some Neanderthal cemeteries show infants buried ritually, while others suggest concentrated deaths, difficult to separate from accidents, disease, or intent. Thus, Neanderthals embodied both protection and destruction. Which element prevailed depended on the environment: glacial climate, famine, or intergroup competition. If infanticidal behavior occurred frequently, it could have driven counter-strategies. For example, alliances among offspring moving to another group, or reproductive spacing, all could reduce risk to the young. In this way, the shadow of infanticide may have imprinted itself onto the social structure of Neanderthals, forcing the species to develop cooperation and protection as a counterbalance. Neanderthals clearly had caregiving abilities far beyond many other primates. Yet, in the evolutionary framework, the question remained: how much did reproductive instincts shape behavior, and how far could Neanderthals transcend them? This question extends beyond Neanderthals to Homo sapiens. Did both species at some point self-domesticate? The self-domestication hypothesis suggests that the capacity for cooperation, protection of vulnerable individuals, and suppression of intra-group violence may have been pivotal in shaping human distinctiveness. The concept arises from contrast. Imagine the difference between a Neanderthal and a wild predatory animal. The Neanderthal face is shorter, the jaw strong but not excessively coarse, and outbursts of aggression somewhat tempered compared with contemporaneous species living in harsh environments. Aggressive individuals could assert power in the moment, but Neanderthal society had ways to minimize sudden eruptions. Many anthropologists and evolutionary biologists observe that dampening extreme aggressive reactions is a critical marker in social evolution. The self-domestication hypothesis proposes that a similar process occurred in Neanderthals hundreds of thousands of years ago, under persistent survival pressures. This theory is linked to communication. Picture a small Neanderthal group living around caves, hunting and sharing food, not vastly different from earlier hominins within the group. A strong individual might be ready to use violence whenever power was challenged. In pure strength confrontations, it could overwhelm others. But if other Neanderthals communicated, exchanging conflicts around the fire, silently forming alliances against the aggressive individual, that power was constrained. The violent individual faced not a single rival, but a coalition. When the alliance decided enough was enough, the aggressive member could not persist for long. Anthropologists call this mechanism reversed dominance. Unlike chimpanzee troops, where a violent alpha maintains power through strength, Neanderthals could combine signals gestures, and coordinated planning, alliances and cooperation became more important than muscle. Over time, this mechanism may have reshaped behavior and social structure. Individuals unable to control anger, frequently using violence, risked ostracism, isolation, or even death. Meanwhile, those who cooperated, shared food, and supported hunting survived, passing these social survival traits to the next generation over tens of thousands of years. This produced a slow but steady natural selection against impulsive aggression. Neanderthals, in social evolution, became more manageable, less fierce in social interactions, similar to how domesticated species show reduced reactive aggression. Some signs of this process remain in anatomy. Compared with earlier hominins, Neanderthals had smaller brow ridges, more gracile facial structures, less robust jaws, and cranial features reflecting neoteny, their faces and behavior retained. Juvenile-like traits relative to other adult individuals. These traits made Neanderthal faces shorter, jaws thinner, and teeth smaller. Similar changes occur in domesticated animals. In Russian fox domestication experiments, individuals selected for tameness developed floppy ears, shorter snouts, and playful behaviors expressions of reduced reactive aggression. Neanderthals lacked floppy ears, but evolutionary trends toward aggression control are evident. The easiest evolutionary path was not toward fierce warriors, but toward individuals capable of subtle coordination. This tendency was partly maintained through social punishment. When an individual became excessively violent, the group could silently coordinate to remove it, sometimes through ostracism, sometimes through lethal action planned to effectively neutralize the aggressive member. The most violent individuals lost privileges. They were removed. In this way, calm, cooperative individuals survived and transmitted social survival traits to subsequent generations. With aggression reduced, cooperation, food sharing, infant care, and ritual participation became possible without interruption from sudden outbursts. Over generations, calm, bonded, and tolerant individuals were selected, becoming central to group survival. The pillars of Neanderthal society: cooperative hunting, sharing, learning could develop only if the group controlled individuals unable to self-regulate aggression. Some critics emphasize that violence persisted in hominin history, but the self-domestication hypothesis does not claim Neanderthals were entirely gentle. Rather, they became less immediately reactive to aggression. A predator might strike suddenly, but others learned to delay, coordinate, and prioritize long-term strategy. Violence remained, but was more controlled, more calculated. Some genetic evidence suggests changes in serotonin and dopamine pathways. Features of the domestication syndrome: reduced facial robustness, retained juvenile traits, curiosity, and playfulness appear in Neanderthals as in domesticated animals. Shortened faces and modified vocal tracts may have allowed Neanderthals to produce more sounds, paving the way for complex communication, a prerequisite for alliances and social coordination. More alliances restrained aggressive individuals. Over time, aggression declined, faces changed, communication became clearer. Acceptance of strangers developed, enabling mating, food exchange, and expanded intergroup relationships. In gatherings tens of thousands of years ago, the ability to restrain aggression was a survival factor. Without it, every encounter risked massacre. Thanks to this capacity, culture could spread, innovation could be transmitted, populations could expand. Yet the haunting question remains: did Neanderthals truly self-domesticate, or is this a modern interpretation imposed on the past? No hand stood above the group to select the violent or reward the gentle. It happened within the groups themselves. Through alliances and ways they maintained order together. Neanderthal groups, hunting alliances, whispered agreements around the fire performed this work. The idea carries profound humility. Neanderthals did not transcend animal instincts through strength or luck alone. They did so by silently linking together to restrain the most violent individuals. Yet the theory still leaves many gaps. Not every Neanderthal group punished aggressive individuals to the same extent. In some environments, violent members could still dominate in hunting or territory. Fossils and traces show groups once led by strong, aggressive individuals. Self-domestication may have laid a foundation, but variations in group, environment, and survival culture tilted the balance in many directions. The hypothesis remains debated. Did evolution prune Neanderthals this way, or was group culture the decisive factor? Fossils may suggest, genetics may whisper, but no one can confirm for certain. What is clear is that Neanderthals occupied a strange middle ground. Neither the most violent primates nor the gentlest Neanderthals living in groups where cooperative hunting and food sharing could extend to a dozen. Individuals could simultaneously mobilize all forces to confront intruders or enemies. Calling this phenomenon self-domestication reminds us that, if it occurred, it was fragile and incomplete. Aggressive outbursts decreased, but never disappeared entirely. So did Neanderthals self-domesticate. Perhaps the more precise question is, did groups create conditions in which individuals unable to regulate aggression were gradually removed, leaving calmer, more cooperative members? If so, Neanderthal social foundations rested not only on stone tools, fire, or hunting, but on whispered agreements around the fire. Alliances against violent members, and the quiet courage to stand together and say, enough. The haunting question remains: if Neanderthals once self-domesticated, could they do it again when facing new forms of aggression, shaped by circumstance and group innovation? Were Neanderthals inherently fierce, or were they creatures transformed by environment and circumstance? This is a question that never fades, repeating across generations of hominin research. Whenever traces of violence appear in fossils, the question becomes urgent. Whenever one envisions a Neanderthal group living harmoniously, the scene is both fragile and innocent. When fossilized bones and stone tools from the distant past confront us with evidence of both brutality and cooperation, researchers seek explanatory frameworks to understand behavior. Long before modern archaeology or anthropology, philosophers asked, is violence instinctive or a product of environment and social circumstance? From a historical perspective, Aristotle, in the 4th century BC, described humans as political animals, beings shaped to live within communities and reach their full potential through participation in social structures. For Aristotle, violence was not intrinsic to human nature. Instead, reason and language, the ability to judge fairness and injustice, distinguished humans from other species. However, he recognized that conflict and power struggles were constant. Social capacity was both a source of strength and a source of conflict. This idea planted the paradox that humans and Neanderthals had to face. Living together conferred power, but also generated rivalry and competition. Similarly, Confucian thinkers of the 6th-5th centuries BCE viewed humans as having the potential for goodness, but requiring cultivation. Violence did not arise from nature, but from neglecting relationships of respect and responsibility. This principle can be applied to Neanderthals. Groups that maintained bonds and restrained violent individuals survived, while those that neglected cohesion fell apart. Moving to more modern perspectives, Hobbes argued that in a natural state, humans were beasts, and peace could only be secured through centralized power. For Neanderthals, without alliances and internal control, groups would likewise descend into constant warfare, survival depending solely on individual strength. In contrast, Rousseau proposed that humans in their natural state were peaceful, and violence arose with private property and inequality. For Neanderthals, cooperation, sharing, and quiet alliances could be seen as a means to maintain peace, while violence primarily emerged from resource competition and harsh environmental pressures. Civilization or social mechanisms were not inherently bad, but they created pressures that forced individuals to compete, envy, and accumulate. If Hobbes trusted in a violent nature, Rousseau trusted in a harmonious one. Neanderthals may have occupied a middle ground. Violence had the potential to erupt, but alliances and self-imposed sanctions limited its destructive scope. This debate is not merely historical. When archaeologists discover skeletons pierced by arrows or fractured by stone, the question arises: do these traces prove that Neanderthal life before social mechanisms was a continuous war, every individual against every other? Or do the bones reveal an abnormal collapse of natural cooperative instincts in Neanderthal groups when faced with famine or resource disputes? Every fracture, every impact can be viewed from multiple perspectives, and our interpretations often reflect modern viewpoints rather than the silent testimony of the past. Between the notion of inevitable violence and the image of peaceful communities lies a spectrum of thought seeking to balance both. Violence coexisting with cooperation. In Neanderthal communities, self-interest and mutual support existed side by side. Small groups could link together, share food, protect one another from danger, yet encounters of violence occurred over territory, prey, or water. Social structure, hunting skill, and alliance building determined the levels of aggression or harmony. Some modern studies suggest that intergroup violence among Neanderthals paradoxically promoted internal organization and cooperation. Conflicts between bands forced survivors to learn sharing, coordinated hunting, territory defense, and child protection. These theoretical frameworks, though formed centuries later, help interpret prehistoric evidence. Neanderthals possessed both violent capacities and the ability to form alliances. Did Neanderthal groups live in perpetual violence, as Hobbes imagined, or were they largely harmonious until survival pressures sparked conflict? As Rousseau suggested, bones cannot answer directly, but contemplating this question long before skeletal discoveries shows the depth of the puzzle. Was Neanderthal violence an individual issue or a collective one? Within groups, leadership and hunting experience could shape conflict intensity. A well-structured band with strong leaders and coordinated hunting skills likely reduced fatal injuries. Conversely, disorganized groups fell into cycles of retaliation and prolonged clashes. Even in harsh environments, Neanderthals could learn compromise, sharing, and temporary alliances. Conflicts did not vanish, but could be restrained through group organization. The oscillation between violence and cooperation was inseparable from Neanderthal life. This unresolved tension keeps questions of violence and cooperation persistent. Thousands of years later, as archaeology genetic data, and primate studies advanced, the issue resurfaces. Is violence an instinct for survival, or a consequence of environmental pressures and group culture? This is not only a scientific puzzle, but also an ethical question about survival and community. Understanding Neanderthal nature shapes perceptions of human history. If violence is instinctive, cooperation exists through group strength and temporary alliances. If cooperation is intrinsic, violence arises when survival conditions become harsh. Likely, both are true, and vigilance and mutual observation are essential for survival. When examining fractured skulls, pierced ribs, or broken long bones, it is impossible to judge whether this reflects error or inevitability. These traces tell a story of survival, conflict, and survival pressures. Bones do not lie. Arrows lodged in bones and skulls, crushed by clubs, revealed that real violence once existed. As archaeologists record injury frequency in Neanderthal groups over time, a picture emerges. Small, scattered groups sometimes experienced more violence than later communities with more complex social structures. The most dangerous periods may have been when groups were still small, hunting and defending territory without widespread alliance systems. Evidence from Middle Paleolithic sites shows startlingly high lethal violence. Up to 15% of skeletons bear signs of death by weapons or blunt trauma. Some still have arrows lodged in bones, skulls crushed by clubs or axes. Cemeteries revealed that men, women, and children were victims alike, emphasizing that small groups could still cause lethal harm to one another. Why was violence common in sparse populations? Each group had limited access to territory and resources: a fish pond, a valley rich in game, a riverside for campfires. Without intermediating mechanisms, conflicts easily escalated into cycles of revenge and prolonged violence, repeating across generations. As Neanderthal society stabilized, forming larger bands and proto-villages, lethal violence declined relatively. Violence did not disappear, but temporary social organizations, territorial divisions, and intergroup agreements reduced conflict. In many populations, lethal violence dropped from high Middle Paleolithic levels to 2 to 3%. The reasons: leadership structures, cooperative hunting, clear boundaries, and reduced survival pressure due to food surpluses. Fixed groups encouraged negotiation rather than constant confrontation. A Neanderthal society with organization, alliances, leadership, and defined boundaries can be seen as the first peace project in prehistory. Yet, violence persisted. Mass graves testify to massacres. The difference lies in proportion. In a band of 100 individuals, 15 deaths from violence in a generation could wipe out a lineage, while the rest survived through cooperation, alliances, and group discipline in large Neanderthal camps, where hundreds gathered around caves and hunting grounds. Even a violent attack might claim only a small fraction of the community. These numbers are stark, yet suggest that daily life could be less overshadowed by violent death when the group was large enough to maintain collective safety. The question of violence vision remains. In small hunter-gatherer bands, violence was direct, clubs striking bones, stones, and arrows piercing skulls. As larger groups emerged, violence became more abstract, organized through territorial disputes, aimed at distant groups, sometimes leaving only traces of fire in settlements. This shift made the archaeological record complex and difficult to interpret. Asterisk, a burned camp may signal conflict, but without skeletons, it does not appear in percentages. Thus, the reduction of violence seems to also reflect changes in what leaves traces. Nevertheless, the contrast between cemeteries, full of pierced bones, and later sites with fewer injuries remains undeniable. One of the clearest windows into this transition comes from large valleys where Neanderthal groups once concentrated. Ancient cemeteries, tens of thousands of years old, reveal high rates of violent injury, with many individuals dying from stone points, axes, or clubs. But millennia later, in larger settlements, violent mortality decreased significantly as Neanderthal camps became more stable, near resource-rich riverbanks and sheltered caves. Disputes began to be regulated through group structures rather than continuous raiding. When these groups cooperated in hunting and shared territories, violence became the prerogative of temporary leadership rather than an everyday reality for all members. Similar patterns can be observed in many other large European cave sites. Early Neanderthal cemeteries sometimes still contain evidence of deadly conflicts, but overall, violent death rates declined compared to the earlier foraging period. In Central Europe, sites show a marked reduction in skeletal trauma as groups began living more stably around caves and fixed food sources. Life in caves, with collective sleeping areas and shared food, though monotonous, was still safer than the constantly moving life of small groups across dangerous hunting grounds. This change is important because it challenges intuition. Earlier small groups were not peaceful havens. Violence was high, whereas larger groups, despite hierarchy and competition, provided relative protection from sudden death. Skeletal evidence suggests that violence was more frequent in small foraging bands, while larger communities, despite new conflicts, provided relative safety. This does not mean the process was smooth or universal. Periods of increased violence still occurred, often linked to food scarcity or climate fluctuations. Climate variability could create scarcity, sparking conflicts between Neanderthal groups. Cultural practices, such as sacrificial rituals or ancestor veneration, may have introduced forms of organized violence. And naturally, as groups formed alliances or engaged in larger territorial disputes, the risk of violence increased. Yet, measured by the proportion of skeletons with lethal trauma, the trend from small foraging bands to larger settlements is downward, and this is worth reflecting upon. Looking at the archaeological record, violence is not a fixed constant, but a variable, rising or falling according to social structure. Neanderthals were neither condemned to endless war nor guaranteed absolute peace. Everything was shaped by circumstance, scarcity or abundance, and the presence or absence of mechanisms controlling conflict within the group. Bones whisper a paradox. Stable environments, abundant food, and concentrated camps, though burdened by disputes, could reduce the risk of violent death. Large caves, even when crowded, could help survival without killing neighbors. What appears as a reduction in violence in one aspect may represent progress in another. A haunting question remains. If large Neanderthal groups reduced everyday violence, why did they also allow for serious, lethal conflicts? How could male lineages within a group vanish entirely? It sounds like legend, stories told around the fire about failed bands and conquered territories. But this is not legend. Traces are found in ancient DNA extracted from Neanderthal and early Homo sapiens skeletons. When geneticists reconstructed DNA, they discovered something astonishing in many places. The Y chromosome of local male lineages disappeared within a few generations, almost entirely replaced by individuals from newly arriving groups. Entire paternal ancestries were erased to the point that only echoes remain in today's genetic maps. The story begins when one Neanderthal group migrated or invaded the territory of another, bringing hunting expertise, social mechanisms, and adaptability to new environments. Archaeology shows that mobility, coordinated hunting, and tool-making skills gave the new group an advantage. When encountering long-established settlements, newcomers either dominated or integrated, altering the genetic and cultural structure of local populations. Within a few generations, many of the old group's Y chromosomes vanished. Overall, mixing preserved some continuity with the previous group. But the male line told a different story. Indigenous Y lineages were almost entirely erased. Causes may include direct conflict, disease, or new social structures compelling surviving women to integrate into the new group. Ancient DNA from skeletons of this period reveals traces of disease and conflict. Neanderthal population changes were not always peaceful. Systematic violence existed, with burial pits containing men, women, and children killed in violent events. Although not all sites are directly associated with major conflicts, these events remind us that demographic and power shifts in Neanderthal groups were often linked to violence and survival competition. When male lineages disappeared from the record, the story of force, genetics, and violence remained visible in the surviving bones. The stones, Neanderthals, stacked still stand, but the groups living around them have vanished. Looking across European valleys and plateaus, these traces illustrate the violent storms of survival across ancient icy plains and forests. These changes did not occur gradually, but as abrupt breaks in Neanderthal population history, reshaping not only habitation sites, but also ancestral lines and intergroup relationships. While factors such as food scarcity, territorial conflict, disease, or violence can be identified, the lived survival experience of those generations remains beyond full recovery. Male lineages lost in conflicts or migrations left no echo. Instead, surviving groups carried forward strength and strategies, opening a new rhythm of life for remaining communities. During this period, violence was no longer just a personal spear or small-scale raid. It became a rule-governing group, survival and territorial control. Conflicts were not only over water or hunting grounds. They asserted dominance over territory, marking a group's influence with weapons, fire, and biological intimidation, shaping the memory of other groups to the point where only traces in soil and ash remained. In many regions, Neanderthal groups are known for deliberate terror strategies. Clubs, axes, spears, and fire were used not only for hunting but also to warn enemies, control territory, and enforce loyalty. Remaining skeletons show horrific traces, penetrating skull injuries, deliberately broken bones, and bodies abandoned in deserted settlements. This was not random violence, but calculated messaging. Opposing large groups or attacking strangers could result in annihilation. Submission was sometimes the path to survival, but also meant surrendering territory, food, or members to stronger groups. Stronger groups relied on stone weapons, spears, and organized hunting tactics, precursors to primitive armies in later communities. Violence was not accidental. It was a framework supporting survival. 1,000 years later, Neanderthal groups in other regions developed coordinated strategies. Violence remained immense, but was combined with absorption of weaker groups, territorial consolidation, and shaping community relationships. Conquered groups could lose freedom of movement or access to food, but over time might integrate into the broader network, learning survival from larger communities. Hunting routes and camp areas were reorganized by victorious groups, creating temporary order. Peace in large communities often depended on the ability to suppress and control. Violence remains indicate thousands of deaths, with many survivors absorbed into other groups. While numbers are not absolutely precise, the principle is clear. Violence was a necessary cost for group survival. Even in communities maintaining primitive rituals and rules, over time, Neanderthal groups moved rapidly across vast areas, using strategies based on intimidation and coalition to expand territory. Opposing groups were eliminated, individuals killed or absorbed into the victorious group. Surrendering groups were often spared, but required to follow new rules and structures. This dual strategy made Neanderthal leaders not only conquerors, but also architects of larger territorial formation during the Ice Age. Violence opened the way. Cooperation and exchange filled the gaps. Hunting routes and camp areas developed, protected by strategies that had previously eliminated rivals. These pieces of evidence indicate that large-scale violence was not an aberration, but a central mechanism of survival. Conflict nourished the group through food acquisition, labor absorption, and intimidation of competitors. Temporary structures, hunting traps, or large camps were created under the pressure of war. Many large-scale constructions, mass graves, large communal shelters relied on the strength and lives of individuals. This suggests a troubling possibility. Neanderthals' deepest survival achievements may not have been separable from organized ruthlessness. Yet a contrast emerges. Violence during the foraging period and early settlement was random, intimate, and localized. Large communities scaled up violence, organized it, and industrialized it. Leaders organized resources, hunting engineers set traps, and violent acts were understood as a necessary part of group order. Violence was expanded, rationalized, and sometimes considered a survival strategy. This shift forces a question. Did Neanderthals' ability to organize communities emerge despite violence, or because of it? Large communities remained fragile. A group at maximum strength could collapse under pressure from allied rival groups. Long-standing dominant communities still dissolved when internal conflict or natural disasters struck. Violence could build a community, but it could also destroy it. A group formed through conflict strategies had to constantly maintain power, and when strength waned, collapse occurred quickly. This pattern indicates a stark reality. Violence often served as the midwife of territorial expansion, but rarely guaranteed long-term stability. What remained were hunting routes, strategic ideas, and sometimes legends of group unity. Could Neanderthal communities expand territory without violence? Or was conflict simply the price all groups paid to survive and grow? Other foraging groups and early settled communities show the same pattern in different cultural forms. Some foraging groups transformed war and conflict into survival rituals, not only to seize territory or resources, but also to consolidate power and organize the group. Violence, through ritual, attack, or coordinated effort, shaped religion, ritual, and authority. For them, community existence was inseparable from organized bloodshed. Neighboring groups participated in cycles of conflict, but it was these Neanderthal groups that made war a central pillar of survival until environmental changes or the arrival of Homo sapiens ended their dominance. Far to the east, Neanderthal groups rose and fell in survival cycles marked by territorial clashes. Communities that allied or confronted each other formed and broke territorial orders, creating temporary, concentrated survival zones that emerged only after weaker groups were eliminated or absorbed. Neanderthal groups on the plains, from northern European valleys to the Iberian highlands, continued to face natural storms and survival competition. Intergroup conflicts not only protected water sources and hunting grounds, but also determined control over larger territories. As elsewhere, these clashes were often interpreted by groups as restoring order in territory, rather than merely expanding range. While some groups relied on fear to maintain power, others sought balance, placing territory and group above all violent acts. On the southern European peninsula and Central Asia, other Neanderthal groups built power not only through violent strength, but also via organization and resource management. Some leaders, renowned for guiding their groups through war and natural disasters, established control through bloody hunts. These moments, from hunting giant mammoths to seizing rival caves, left marks on the landscape. Broken bones, shattered stone, and smoldering fire. These violent acts served survival functions, stabilizing groups and preserving lineages. Without such conflicts, Neanderthal groups would have lacked opportunities to expand territory, consolidate the group, and form larger social assemblies. This paradox repeated across generations. Groups formed and expanded through violence, sometimes followed only later by periods of peace and cohesion. Even in remote wildernesses, archaeology shows cycles of hunting, conflict, and migration repeating in similar patterns. Some regions, like the Pyrenees valleys or Central European plains, saw groups clash to control water sources and hunting grounds. Violence created boundaries, but hunting activities, resource sharing, and mutual learning filled the gaps. Overall, this evidence suggests one thing: Neanderthal groups did not enter conflicts reluctantly. They used them as tools for survival and expansion. Groups justified their actions in many ways through roaring, hunting rituals, displays of strength, or religious ceremonies. The outcomes were consistent. Territory expanded, groups survived or absorbed individuals from other groups, and the remaining caves, bone deposits, and stone tools testified to power and organization. Beneath natural stone walls, mountain peaks, and forests, questions of order and conflict still echo. If Neanderthal groups expanded territory through conflict, could large-scale cooperation occur only after hunts and wars? Or are we biased in looking at the surviving traces? Preserved caves show surviving groups, while smaller, more peaceful groups with fewer traces disappeared over time. Did Neanderthals ever experience absolute peace? This is hard to answer when the remaining evidence largely reflects combat, hunting, and survival competition. Archaeological data suggests something counterintuitive. If a group was to survive the violence and harshness of the environment, the last Ice Age groups had higher chances of survival thanks to organization, cooperation, and learning from previous generations. Understanding this requires observing how violence changed over hundreds of generations. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, groups across Europe and Western Asia experienced large hunts and intense conflicts, resulting in thousands of deaths during collective hunts or cave disputes. These events did not produce lawless societies. On the contrary, They forged group bonds, shaping territory and social structure. For individuals caught in these upheavals, the world did not appear peaceful. It was a chain of harsh survival. Yet beneath the traces of bones, stone, and tools, subtle changes occurred. Intergroup. Personal conflict gradually decreased as groups learned to divide resources and establish more stable relationships. The archaeological record shows that by the end of the Pleistocene, intergroup conflict remained high but had decreased compared to previous generations. Collective hunts were better coordinated, defenses were prepared, and small groups were less often completely wiped out. Over time, cooperative and social communication skills increased, reducing direct violence. This change was not because Neanderthals became virtuous, but as a result of social structure, stable territories, habitual hunting and sharing, and informal rules governing access to hunting grounds and caves. Groups learned to manage conflict, delegate authority, and form alliances. In other words, if an individual wanted to steal food from a neighbor, the group enforced rules against it. Only members with roles in the group, such as hunters or leaders, could perform violent acts, and even then only within survival limits. This was the institutionalization of prehistoric violence. Unwritten decisions and rules maintained order. Personal violence was controlled, redirected toward collective hunting, resource distribution, and group protection. This framework allowed Neanderthal groups to survive long-term. Modern studies show that, while violent instincts persisted, social structure, group relationships, and cultural traditions restrained them. Archaeological data indicate notable patterns. Larger groups became increasingly stable. Caves were used efficiently, hunting areas and plant zones were protected, and conflict rates declined over time. Some tools and sites formerly associated with conflict were repurposed for cooperation and survival across much of prehistoric Europe. Except for volatile regions, the downward trend in violence persisted. Dangerous tools were controlled, collective hunting grounds organized. Violent behaviors that were once public became regulated by group rules. Practices like personal power struggles declined as groups learned to coordinate. The everyday brutality of earlier Neanderthal generations was far greater than contemporary perception. But over time, cooperative skills and violence management emerged. However, it is important to note that the decline in violence was uneven. Groups facing environmental upheaval or major conflicts still suffered catastrophic losses. Some populations were completely wiped out due to disease, resource depletion, or clashes with neighboring groups. Similar to the fate of indigenous communities in the Americas, after contact with stronger forces centuries later, the remaining traces of Neanderthal groups cannot be taken as evidence of reduced violence. Intergroup conflicts once produced some of the largest demographic catastrophes in human history. Researchers have noted that when one group experienced a temporary period of stability, another could suffer disaster. Questions remain about how violence emerged and spread within prehistoric communities. Larger Neanderthal groups, living in valleys and highlands, sometimes competed for territory and food over cycles lasting multiple generations. Periods of calm between conflicts could last decades, yet were punctuated by fierce battles that claimed thousands of lives in each generation. Battles and survival catastrophes never disappeared. They shifted in scale, from small skirmishes between two bands to prolonged sieges as one group attempted to seize another's lair or strategic hunting grounds. Researchers caution that looking solely at the number of surviving caves or mass graves could give the false impression that violence decreased, whereas catastrophic outbreaks continued to occur periodically. If one were to chart the proportion of individuals killed by violence relative to the total population of Neanderthal communities over millennia, the curve trends downward but never flattens. Prehistoric cemeteries, such as those in the Sahara or Natarok, showed 10 to 20% of individuals dying violently. Some prolonged battles, large group hunts, or lair disputes could consume 5 to 10% of the total population in a region. Compared with later periods of intense conflict, the absolute rates remain immense in the final stages of Neanderthal existence. Battles still occurred, but groups developed more sophisticated tactics, minimizing losses relative to the total population. The emergence of stable living zones and sustainable food sources allowed some groups to maintain relative peace, yet violence remained latent. Early social structures, group rules, hunting roles, territorial divisions functioned as the peacekeeping mechanisms of the time. When groups strictly adhered to these norms, large battles were less frequent. When rules were lax, conflict erupted violently. These norms reflected an understanding that not all violent acts were acceptable within the band. Even leading groups were bound by constraints. A band leader could not attack neighboring groups arbitrarily without provoking collective response. Neanderthal groups knew that uncontrolled violence led to decreased reproduction and territorial loss. Yet natural disasters, famine, or the sudden movement of another band could still overturn this fragile balance. Violence was restrained by group rules, deterrence, and movement strategies. But new tools and tactics, slung spears, arrows, ambushes in forests opened new pathways for conflict. Compared with the past, marked by mass graves and spears surrounding caves, surviving groups were relatively more stable, yet still far from absolute peace. Violence was not eliminated. It was managed, guided by group norms, or pushed into more distant territories. Long-term reductions in violence may have occurred, but were fragile, uneven, and dependent on environment, resources, and group density. The haunting question is, if peace in Neanderthal communities relied on social structures, hunting rules, and stable territories, what would happen if one element collapsed? Would the trend of declining violence continue, or would the fragile veneer of peace quickly crumble? Examining decades of conflicts in detail reveals a more complex picture of violence. When large Neanderthal groups encountered one another, conflicts occurred within localized zones rather than across entire regions. Battles were fierce, but usually confined to hunting grounds, lairs, or strategic pathways. Some internal conflicts over territory or food resulted in heavy losses. Neighboring groups, if they intervened, sometimes prevented disaster, but not always successfully. Caves could be besieged, water sources controlled, and dozens of individuals killed or expelled. These massacres represent the darkest moments in Neanderthal existence. Even interventions by allied or neutral groups sometimes failed to prevent catastrophe, demonstrating that maintaining order was only effective when norms and group strength were sufficient. Some groups, through coordinated strategy and effective management, controlled violence, stabilized territories, and reduced battle fatalities. The difference between failure and success lay not in survival instincts, but in tactics, resources, and choices. Even when average mortality from violence declined across generations, the risk of rapid, organized, and destructive outbreaks persisted within Neanderthal communities. The cause was not some ancient tribal instinct, but competition for territory, hunting, and mobilizing bands against one another. Delayed responses from neighboring groups demonstrate that overall reductions in violence did not mean an end to conflict. Yet, viewed broadly, the frequency and intensity of intergroup warfare tended to decrease after a long period of learning territorial control. Neanderthal groups rarely engaged in direct conflict with stronger groups. Conflicts still occurred, but on a limited scale and often accompanied by band negotiations, surveillance of water sources, or les practices unimaginable to earlier generations. All of this forced groups to learn caution. Violence had not disappeared and never would, but the conditions triggering its outbreak or lull band tactics, social norms, intergroup cooperation became clearer. Any reduction in violence, if real, was not a story of heroes triumphing over evil, but of fragile systems restraining a species. Capacity for destruction. The haunting question remains: could those systems withstand natural storms, droughts, food scarcity, or expanding conflicts? Would they one day collapse, reminding us that the boundary between peace and violence is always thin? After a journey through caves, skeletons, mass graves, spears, fractured skulls of forgotten individuals, and the remnants left by groups, one question persists. Did Neanderthal groups ever escape the division between us and them? A seemingly simple question, yet profoundly deep. For millions of years, Neanderthal groups survived through meticulous observation: who was safe, who posed potential danger. Initially, threats came from darkness, saber-toothed cats hiding in forests. With the mastery of stones and fire, danger shifted toward other Neanderthal groups. Living within a band meant living socially, yet that society always had boundaries, boundaries between kin and strangers, allies and enemies. One band and another were never fixed. They shifted, expanded, contracted, shaped by chance, genetics, and band culture. 50,000 years ago, our band was a hunting group, linked by blood. 40,000 years ago, markers from shells, beads, to face paint served as clear signals. I belong to this band, not that one. These markers acted as flags on the body, reminding the band of long-standing boundaries. Over 5,000 years ago, the concept of our band could extend to large settlements, a kingdom, even an empire. Today, in theory, a band could encompass an entire species across all continents. Yet the question remains: how far can that boundary expand before old instincts pull divisions back? Even the earliest ornaments carried this message, defining the band, separating outsiders. These habits never disappeared. From painted faces, marked tools, to passports or wedding rings, Neanderthals always left signs of identity. The tragedy is that every marker of belonging carried a shadow of exclusion. Saying "I am part of the band" also implied the existence of those not in the band. These dualities make it difficult to classify Neanderthals as inherently violent or peaceful. Instincts to protect one's band sometimes led to harm against outside groups. Language allowed sharing of stories and rules, but could also dehumanize and incite hatred. There was no fixed Neanderthal nature, no gene or skull shape predestining violence, but neither existed a switch to permanently eliminate it. Bones tell the story. At Jebel Sahar, Sudan, Nataro, Kenya, Dalheim, Germany, groups were wiped out in sudden, brutal moments. Yet at the same time, countless other communities lived without leaving such scars. Massed graves are easily excavated, while quiet periods of peace vanished. The archaeological record favors violence because injuries leave traces on bones, whereas peaceful existence rarely does. Living peacefully together, intergroup marriages, long-distance exchanges of obsidian or shells occurred without leaving pierced bones. One cannot take the surviving evidence as a measure of the entire past. Neanderthal ancestors did not live in continuous war. Evidence of violence is clear, but evidence of cooperation is equally impressive. Tool sharing, care for the injured, the ability to survive in all environments, even dark places like where bones bear cut marks. Was it cruelty or hunger? Ritual or despair? The task is not to provide a simple answer, but to acknowledge complexity, to hold contradictions as one would hold the heavy stone tools of ancestors. Compared with chimpanzees and bonobos, two possibilities emerge. Chimpanzees conduct coordinated ambushes, while bonobos use alliances and intimacy to reduce tension. Genetic distance is small, yet behavioral differences are vast, proving that Neanderthal violence was not inevitable. Evolution creates tendencies, but culture leads the way. Ancient philosophers such as Hobbes, Rousseau, and Aristotle grappled with this paradox. Humans are wicked without authority, or primal nature is corrupted by civilization, or life is impossible without community. In another tradition, Confucius emphasized harmony and the cultivation of virtue. Each perspective captures part of the truth, yet Neanderthal nature fluctuated with circumstances, never fixed. On one hand, Neanderthals were fortunate. The risk of being killed by others declined over time. Wars still occurred, but on a smaller scale. Homicide rates gradually fell. On the other hand, ancient instincts remained. Tribalism, ethnic competition, dehumanization of enemies. The boundary between our band and other bands narrowed but never vanished. The haunting question persists. Is it possible to live without division? Cultural innovations, expanding moral circles, sharing resources, empathy beyond kimprov, evidence that Neanderthals could transcend band limits. Yet empathy was fragile, easily manipulated. A rumor or slogan could shrink the circle in days. There was no overarching plan. The path from prey to apex predator, then building territories, emerged from climate shifts, disease, mutations, and the fragile existence of small groups. We inherit that precarious victory daily without noticing. The boundary between our band and others is not a law of biology, but a habit etched over millennia of fear and survival. Habits can change. A brain that once learned to shape stone now learns to write poetry, share food, and imagine rights. The question remains, did Neanderthals perceive that potential? Or did they continue drawing smaller circles, excluding more individuals? Archaeologists still ask, is peace achievable? Bones remind us that divisions were always written in soft soil, not stone. Fires flicker, circles shift, and the story continues. If this story helps you sleep, study, or escape the noise, thank you for being here. If you wish for more people to know this Neanderthal story, share it. Remain curious, calm, and continue moving along this current of time.